What if Riot announced a brand new Valorant agent tomorrow? But instead of being controlled by a player, this agent is controlled by an AI. How would it learn to play? How would it know when to flash, when to plant the spike, or when it's time to go for a retake? And more importantly, how do we get from an AI that plays Valorant to an AI like ChatGPT, one that can actually have a conversation with you? Most people think artificial intelligence is simply born intelligent, like someone sits down, writes thousands of rules into a program, and that's it. But that's not how it works at all. To understand it, let's imagine we have a completely brand new player. Not a bad player. Worse, someone who's never played a shooter in their life. They don't know what Jet does. They don't know what Omen does. They don't know what planting the spike means. They don't even know they're supposed to shoot the enemy. They load into a match and do absolutely everything at random. They buy an operator and pistol round, throw abilities into the sky, run around making noise the entire game, and probably end up shooting a wall. If you watch them play, you'd think they had thousands of hours just in a completely different game. Now imagine that player finishes a match, they lose, they play another one, they lose again, another match, another loss. But after thousands and thousands of games, something interesting starts to happen. They notice that whenever they aim for the head, they win more fights. Whenever they listen for footsteps before peeking, they survive more often. Whenever they plant the spike instead of chasing kills, their team wins more rounds. Nobody ever handed them a guide explaining exactly what to do in every situation. They simply started recognizing patterns, and that's exactly what machine learning is. The name sounds incredibly complicated, but the idea is actually very simple. Learning from examples. Instead of manually programming every single rule, we let the system observe massive amounts of data until it discovers those rules on its own. It's like watching VCT matches for the first time. At first, all you see are gunfights and explosions. But the more matches you watch, the more you start noticing things you completely missed before. You recognize when a team is setting up a fake. You notice when someone saves an ability for the post-plant. You understand when the economy forces a team to play differently. You didn't learn because someone handed you a list of rules. You learned because you started recognizing patterns. That's machine learning. But here's the problem. Valorant has way too many possible situations. Different maps, different agents, different weapons, different economies, different positions, 5 players on each team making decisions at the exact same time. The number of possible combinations is practically endless. So how does an AI learn something that complex? That's where deep learning comes in. Imagine that instead of one player trying to understand the entire match, you have a whole team analyzing the information. One player focuses only on the minimap, another listens to every sound, another tracks which abilities are available. Another remembers how the previous round played out. Another keeps track of the enemy team's economy. Each one has a tiny job, but when they combine everything they know, they can make a much better decision together. That's essentially what a neural network is. It's not an actual brain, but it's inspired by how neurons work. Each neuron receives information, performs a very small calculation, and passes the result to the next one. Individually, they're incredibly simple, but when you connect millions of them together, they become capable of solving incredibly complex problems. So here is when things get even more interesting. When those neural networks have many, many layers of processing, that's what we call deep learning. The word deep literally refers to those multiple layers. Information passes through layer after layer before reaching a final answer. The first layer detects something very basic. There's an enemy. The next layer understands something a little more advanced. That enemy is holding an operator. The next one interprets the situation. If I swing this angle, I'm probably dead. And another layer reaches a conclusion. It's better to rotate somewhere else. Each layer understands something more complex than the one before it. That's why deep learning was such a huge breakthrough. We no longer had to manually write millions of rules. The neural network could discover incredibly complex relationships by itself. But there's still one very important piece missing. Having a neural network is like having a brand new player with incredible potential. If they never practice, they'll still be terrible. They need training, and that's where model training comes in. Imagine recording 10 million Valorant matches. The AI watches absolutely everything: which weapons every player buys, which abilities they use, where they position themselves, who wins, who loses, what happens after every single decision. Now we do something really interesting. We pause the match right before a player takes an action. Then we ask the AI, what do you think happens next? Maybe it answers, they're going to plant the spike, but instead, the player throws a smoke. Wrong. So we make tiny adjustments to millions of internal values inside the neural network. Then we try again. Another prediction, another mistake, another tiny adjustment. And we repeat that process millions, billions, even trillions of times. It's almost exactly like aim training. You miss a shot, you make a small correction, you shoot again, you miss by a little less, you adjust again. After thousands of repetitions, your aim becomes dramatically better. The AI improves in exactly the same way. It doesn't get better because someone tells it the correct answer from the very beginning. It gets better because it constantly compares what it predicted with what actually happened, then adjusts the way it thinks. And here's another really important detail. The AI doesn't memorize every match. If you showed it 10 million games, memorizing every single one would be impossible. What it learns are patterns. It learns what usually happens in certain situations. It's exactly like a player with 5,000 hours in Valorant. They don't remember every round they've ever played, but if they hear certain footsteps, see certain utility, and notice a particular economy, they immediately have a good idea of what's most likely about to happen. So far, everything we've talked about sounds very connected to Valorant, but ChatGPT doesn't play matches. So what exactly does it train on? Instead of feeding it millions of Valorant games, we feed it millions and millions of pieces of text. Books, articles, conversations, websites, documentation, forums, tutorials, pretty much every kind of text you can imagine. And then we do exactly the same thing. We take a sentence and cut it off right before the next word. For example, the best weapon for an eco round is usually, then the AI tries to guess the next word. Maybe it answers operator, wrong. The next word was sheriff. So once again, it adjusts millions of internal parameters. Then we give it another sentence and another and another, billions of times. Little by little, it starts recognizing patterns in language. It learns which words usually appear together, how sentences are structured, how ideas connect with each other. And after an enormous amount of training, something pretty amazing starts to happen. It starts answering questions, it starts summarizing text, it starts writing stories, it starts translating between languages, it even starts helping people write code. And this is where a lot of people have the wrong idea about ChatGPT. Many people think that when you ask ChatGPT a question, it searches through some massive database looking for the correct answer, kind of like Google, but that's not how it works. ChatGPT doesn't retrieve pre-written answers, it generates them. Every single word you read is chosen in that very moment. First, it predicts which word is most likely to come next. Then it uses that new word to predict the next one, then the next, and the next, until it has built an entire response. It's actually very similar to how a professional Valorant player makes decisions. When they're put into a difficult situation, they don't remember one identical round they played 3 years ago. Instead, they recognize patterns they've seen thousands of times and choose the play that's most likely to work. ChatGPT does exactly the same thing. The only difference is that instead of choosing between throwing a flash or going for a retake, it's choosing between millions of possible words. That's why it can answer completely new questions. That's why it can hold conversations. And that's also why it sometimes gets things wrong, because it isn't pulling a perfect answer out of a database. It's predicting what the next word should be based on every pattern it learned during training. So if we summarize everything we've covered, it all starts with machine learning, which is about learning patterns by observing data. Then comes deep learning, which uses neural networks with many layers to learn much more complex patterns. Those networks improve by making mistakes over and over again, adjusting themselves millions or even billions of times until their predictions become better. And finally, instead of training those networks on Valorant matches, we train them on enormous amounts of text. The result is a model capable of generating natural language like ChatGPT. So the next time you open ChatGPT and ask it a question, Imagine there's a Valorant player behind it with millions of hours of experience, not because it remembers every match it's ever played, but because it's seen so many patterns that it can predict the best possible play, or in this case, the best possible next word. And that's in essence why an artificial intelligence can seem so unbelievably intelligent.